Thank you, Rhona, for that very generous and thoughtful introduction. Kaya, I pay my respect to the Wodja Noongar people on whose Wodja we're on, and all the traditional owners I work with from Kura, the past, Yay, present, and Border, future. That's Noongar language. Today I'm here to talk about firm expectations in a soft space, engagement with, around and through anthropology. I've been an anthropologist, as Rhona said, for almost 30 years, but I haven't always worked in cultural heritage. I've worked as a cultural heritage consultant only for the past 4 years, and in 2 earlier stints in the 1990s and in the early 2000s. All 3 have been under the same Western Australian legislation. Today I want to use these 3 junctures to reflect on shifts in cultural heritage over time and what this could mean for our work as anthropologists now and into the future. As a start, I'd like to differentiate between what I call the hard space and what I call the soft space in cultural heritage. The hard space is defined by statutory approvals, legislation and negotiated agreements. In WA, this largely means the Aboriginal Heritage Act 1972, which has the aim of protecting cultural heritage sites and objects from harm. Large projects such as new mines will also usually need to protect social surroundings under the state's Environmental Protection Act 1986. This can cover matters such as preserving access to important places and maintaining water flow so that traditional owners' experience of a place is not unduly compromised by development. Most of WA is also subject to the Native Title Act 1993, and in many places there are Indigenous land use agreements between proponents and traditional owners. In the hard space, negotiations take place within a framework that leads to a known outcome. Sites are either protected or impacted, social surroundings are compromised or not, native title is won or lost, and agreements are agreed or not. That is not to say that processes and outcomes in the hard space can't be overridden, undermined or overturned, just that relative to the soft space, there is at least some structure in the form of processes to follow, outcomes to measure, and accountabilities to apply. If the hard space is defined by the legislative environment and formal agreements, the soft space is defined by more personal, sometimes subtle and sometimes not so subtle, negotiations which take place between individuals and groups. However, it would be a mistake to think that negotiations in the soft space are actually soft. This space can hold the same sort of concerns and opportunities as the hard space, and engagements often boil over to affect outcomes in the hard space anyway. Negotiations in the hard space and the soft space tend to happen all at the same time in cultural heritage work. Whether a condition falls into the hard or soft space can depend on many factors. For example, traditional owner employment might come under the hard space in a mine development as part of an agreement, but come under the soft space in a property subdivision. In the first case, there would normally be some accountability, but not so in the second case. One of the reasons I believe the now repealed Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act 2021 met with such an outcry from some sectors of the community was the perception that it would pull more conditions from the soft space into the hard space. Even if you don't work in cultural heritage, you would probably know the soft space. To understand engagement in this space a little more, I want to talk about positioning theory, i.e. the mechanisms through which roles are assigned or denied to ourselves and others. Okay, so this is the mid-1990s, my first stint as a cultural heritage consultant. I worked with elders then who wanted me to feel culture, taking me by the hand metaphorically and even literally where they felt it was required. They tried to imbue their culture in me, the implication being that I could then share what mattered in the places where they did not exert influence. At the same time, other traditional owners were very clear that they should be telling their own stories and determining their future, their way, themselves. They didn't need an anthropologist to help them. And those 2 perspectives are diagrammed here. Worried that I would not be able to meet the elders' expectations and unable to articulate to the other traditional owners what value an anthropologist could bring, I left the profession within a year. This seems like a really drastic approach in hindsight, but I was absolutely convinced at the time that it was my only option. A decade later, I was given a second chance to work as a cultural heritage consultant for about 3 years. From the outset of this stint, I took care to position myself in what I could by then see as a space between traditional owners and proponents. To call this the third space may be an overreach if you're thinking along the lines of Homi Bhabha, but the concept is broadly similar. It's an approach which is perhaps more in line with Martin Nakata's idea of a space where different worldviews come together, and Mr. Yunupingu's idea of a space where balance is achieved through competing interests. The idea is to generate wholly new outcomes. In this space, I see my role as being to record information, ensure processes are agreed and followed, voices are heard, outcomes are clear, and ethics are observed. And this is diagrammed on the right. Then and now, I discuss my role with traditional owners and proponents on surveys, especially when I work with new individuals and groups. I'm aware that traditional owners might have a pre-formed opinion of anthropologists taking what we shouldn't, and that proponents might ask us to take more than we should. I've never had much pushback on my deliberate attempts to position myself. I actually don't think that this is because people necessarily agree with what I say. I think traditional owners and proponents are much more interested in observing us in action rather than taking what we say about ourselves at face value. However, recently, a traditional owner I had not worked with before responded in a way that made me really think about my approach quite hard. They said that my positioning in the in-between is what's wrong with modern anthropology. In their view, I was being extractive because I was only taking what was relevant to the proposed development. Not like in the old days when anthropologists were taught to feel culture by our old people so they could go forth and share it. The use of the term extractive really made an impression on me because this was precisely what I'd been working to avoid since the 1990s, and I was completely shocked that I'd missed it, hidden in plain sight. I am actually pleased to say that after that I managed not to leave the profession again, and I'm grateful to this traditional owner for showing me this blind spot, which led me to positioning theory. Positioning theory became popular in the 1990s as a way of explaining interactions between individuals and groups. Centred in social psychology, it's been adopted and developed by practitioners from a range of disciplines to explain interactions. The theory takes as its starting point the understanding that what people do and what they don't do requires us to look at what is permissible to do according to the moral order that's being followed. The positions that we all take in that moral order are determined by the interplay of cultural, legal, institutional, conversational, and personal perspectives. These perspectives are in turn created and recreated every time we interact with the world and every time the world interacts back. Positioning theory sees three ways that interactions can go. First order positioning occurs when a positioning act is not challenged by others. Second order positioning is when it's challenged. And third order is when individuals outside the social environment are influenced by previous social interactions and assume positions based on what they've observed. Put simply, positioning theory is about how society simultaneously stimulates and contains agency. For the individual, this manifests as a relationship between freedom on the one hand and constraint on the other. Positions are held in the specific beliefs that individuals have in the context of rights, what we believe we're owed by others, and duties, what we believe we owe others. These beliefs are influenced by our ongoing storyline, the background to our life, which includes our gender, age, upbringing, history, potential, etc., and also by speech and other acts that happen in the moment, what we say and do in a given engagement. Some of you might recognise some alignment here with Foucault's discourse theory. Because everyone in the engagement is evaluating everyone else against their own ongoing storyline and speech and other acts in the moment, then everyone's position is in a constant state of change. This is illustrated by the positioning triangle. Shifts in the moral order that affect one part of the triangle will change the other parts, i.e. if you change the storyline, you'll change the speech and other acts that occur, which will in turn change position. Positioning can be classified into various types depending on whether it's being done by the self or another and whether it is tacit, unfolds naturally, or deliberate. On the recent survey cited above, I was deliberately self-positioning in order to set myself apart from any negative perceptions that I thought might have been held about anthropologists being extractive. My attempt to position myself was challenged by another, i.e. second order positioning, who had their own way of positioning anthropology and anthropologists. Clearly, I had failed to recognise the moral order that was being followed. Earlier, I mentioned that moral orders are created by the interplay of cultural, legal, institutional, conversational, and personal orders. I'm sure you can all appreciate the first two, cultural and legal, but institutional covers all those perspectives arising from your organisation, your company, your professional affiliations. Positioning theory sees all three of those as being structural. Another part of the moral space is related to agency in the form of conversational and personal moral orders. Here, the normative is created during conversations with people or conversations that we have with ourselves. People alone or when talking to others can design their own moral space, but this still needs to meet the moral order. In hindsight, I can see that my deliberate positioning in the in-between had ramifications for every aspect of the moral order. I brought an approach to bear on a situation which had developed in another moral order, one that was largely shaped by the moral space I had designed from my earlier experiences. In the absence of any knowledge of my ongoing storyline, the traditional owner had no choice but to take what I said at face value. This situation often doesn't come up in longer term relationships between anthropologists and traditional owners because your tacit positioning, what unfolds naturally, is often more in tune with the prevailing order than your deliberate positioning ever can be. So I realise now that these longer term relationships that I might have with traditional owners probably work in spite of, not because of, my deliberate positioning. As a result of these insights, I'm proposing a repositioning away from the in-between to the arrangement on the right. More on this soon. So it should be clear by now that positioning established what we're authorised to say and do based on ours and others' perceptions of our rights and duties. These perceptions are decided by our ongoing storyline and speech and other acts in a given moment. All of this is determined by the prevailing moral order, aka society. I started out by distinguishing between the hard and soft space in cultural heritage. However, having delved into positioning theory, I realise I've probably been seeing things all wrong. Perhaps a more accurate representation of cultural heritage is to forget hard and soft and consider the interplay between structure and agency. When we work in cultural heritage, we're reinforcing structures, those cultural, legal and institutional orders that support the prevailing moral order. We can't really say we're working in the in-between because traditional owners have already had to move a long way from what they might want for their people, culture and country in order to participate in a cultural heritage survey in the first place. Every time we do this work, we're limiting the possibilities of everyone in the engagement to act against a prevailing moral order and to create new moral orders that might see accepted positions challenged. As you might expect, reports of surveys that were done in the 1970s, 80s and 90s are valued by traditional owners today as a record of what their old people said about places, sites, practices, relationships with each other and connections to country. Reports written more recently will tell you more about how people want to manage cultural heritage in light of development. Considering anthropologists are about understanding culture, it doesn't feel like we're leaving much of a legacy for the next generation of traditional owners or anthropologists. This is perhaps more urgent because soon we will battle to find traditional owners and anthropologists in many parts of the state who even remember a moral order from before cultural heritage surveys began. Now looking back, I can't help but think I positioned myself in the in-between, at least in part from colonial cringe, with support from neoliberalism. It wasn't necessarily a positive choice to position myself there because in fact I actually loved working with those elders back in the 90s who did their best to help me feel culture. I certainly wouldn't have positioned myself in the in-between if I didn't have to. Sorry, I just However, it's important to acknowledge that the in-between can have its benefits in that it can bring people together, it can share economic benefits of survey participation among families, and of course it's productive in meeting statutory requirements. However, I firmly believe that if we want better outcomes, we must have new conversations with traditional owners, and we must constantly question ourselves in ways that challenge our position to take up the conversational and personal aspects of the moral order. We aren't going to find those opportunities in cultural heritage consulting as it currently exists. Rather, anthropologists and traditional owners should build relationships that draw us together in a different moral order, one that helps us get a better feeling for culture, or at least a better understanding of how traditional owners feel. Most anthropologists are empathetic, but I'm talking about the sort of feelings that can only come from long periods spent together on country.
5 minutes.
Okay, that's right. When we know this, and when traditional owners know this, then anthropology can inform compliance work rather than compliance work leading anthropology. If culture is at the top of the moral order, we need to start treating it as such. Sorry, just one more. So I hope this talk has shown what I believe is lacking in cultural heritage consulting. Anthropologists will continue to play an important role, but to do our work properly, we need to spend time with people on country outside the constraints of compliance. This means working with family groups, doing things that these families want to do, where our role is not just identification and management of cultural heritage, but maintenance and activation of it. To some degree, this is what those anthropologists of the 70s, 80s and 90s achieved by recording the information they did before the moral order, which is now being followed on heritage surveys, had been fully adopted. Last bit. Okay. I'm not even going to attempt to deliberately position this presentation. I'm sure there'll be those among you who feel that it's been an overly complex way of navigating what actually is obviously common sense. Others will think I've oversimplified highly complex interactions. All I will say in summing up is that if a basic function of society is to contain and stimulate the possibilities of human agency, as positioning theory suggests, then perhaps it's time for us to focus less on containment and more on stimulation. Thank you.